Welcome to Poppin' Lock. I'm Landry Ayers. Socrates once said the unexamined life is not worth living. And if he were around today, I'm sure he'd also say that a bug's life is totally worth examining. Join us as we dive into the 1998 Disney Pixar romp to find out what we can take away with us and what we can leave on the offering stone. With me today is Deputy Managing Editor at Reason and our old friend, Natalie Dowzicki.
I'm happy to be back at my old stomping grounds today, Landry.
We're happy to have you. And Interim Director at libertarianism.org and returning guest, Paul Meany.
Happy to be here.
So, A Bug's Life. Is it worth it to draw some sort of economic or political or philosophical lesson from this film? And if so, what might it be? Because you see a lot of conflicting analysis of this movie, whether it's about class struggle or it's about the failures of bureaucrats lording over people who want to engage in free enterprise or something else. I have trouble nailing down any one particular lesson, but everybody seems to have one that they take away from it. Is there one that you have settled on, each of you? And if so, what is it? And how valuable is it?
I say this with like a little bit of a caveat because I was reading an article about that the directors did and the producers, just like a Q&A, and they were talking about how everyone was reading far too much into this film and that this was not like their intention to make like a communism versus capitalism or socialism versus capitalism movie. But I think that's kind of the beauty of when you look back at older movies and everyone like overanalyzes them. So maybe that wasn't their intention, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that storyline isn't there. However, kind of what I glean from the movie, especially watching it now versus watching it when I was little, is more of like how it's like an innovator story. So like Flick to me is just like has a very much an entrepreneurial spirit. He wants to like get out of the rut that he sees, you know, not only his family, but like other ants like him in. And he's like very proactive about, you know, wanting to create a way to gather the grain more efficiently. And I think it's more of like an innovator story. And like obviously Flick is in the hero's journey here in a very loose sense. But I don't read so much of the socialism versus capitalism is that in the movie as much as maybe Paul does.
Well, what I would say is whether or not it's a worthy question to ask, what can we learn from this movie? It doesn't matter what I think. Multiple academic articles have been written about what Bug's Life is about and how it can be used to teach people different ideas. So it doesn't matter what I think. People have decided it's important already, so it's worthy of engaging with.
So they've validated your thoughts.
They've validated it a lot, you know. Well, no, they're a lot of people on the other opposite end of the spectrum from me. But I think the big lesson from Bug's Life is how much aesthetics covers our worldview. Because being the big loser I am, I read an awful lot about ants before watching Bug's Life again.
Oh my God.
And one of the things is that ants used to be used as this kind of, in the medieval ages and sometimes in political thought and a little bit in the early modern period, ants are always supposed to be the super best organism. They always know their nature. They do what they're told. They have no ego of their own, so they're better. Because they have no will of their own, they're a better ideal society. You can also see this with like bees as well in medieval thought and also with Bernard Mandeville as well. But the idea of animals having some sort of way that humans can learn from, like, oh, the way ants are. There's also the Once and Future King also has a little bit about ants and militarism. But because ants are collectivistic and because at the end of the movie they all link arms together and stomp over the grasshoppers, everyone just assumes it's a socialist film just based off of like aesthetics. Obviously the grasshoppers aren't really Chairman Mao or Stalin or anything. They're just a bunch of gangsters, and they're even portrayed to be like that. And I was always confused when people were saying the grasshoppers were these capitalists, because when they rev their wings, it sounds like motorbikes. And then when they're off relaxing, they're off, you know, in some sombrero, like in the middle of Mexico, they've run off the border. Like, they're supposed to be gangsters that steal. They're not some sort of very organized state or some capitalists. And I've always found it so bizarre. But I think just because of the aesthetics of the ants, the idea of collectivism, some of the lines in the movie, people just get the wrong idea and think all of a sudden, oh yeah, it must be about the working class rising up. Even though Flick, as you said before, is like an innovator. It's a story about someone trying to show different ways of doing things. That's part of Flick's kind of story and his individualism is that he shows Dot the little seed and says, everyone could be this, you just have to wait a little bit of time. And he convinces the ants to think of themselves as more than they are. But that's kind of lost on people.
And I think it really is lost on a lot of people because people want to read something into this film that it really is not. And I see this in a lot of different coverage on both sides of the issue. People have written about how it is explicitly about class struggle and how the ants are the working class who are being oppressed by sort of corporate or, the 1% overlords sort of as such. And then on the other side, that the grasshoppers are bureaucrats who are extracting wealth from the people who are engaging in the work that actually benefits every single person. And none of those are exactly true. But as we've said before, that wasn't the intent of the filmmakers. They're not intending to tell a story about that. It is, in an individualistic sense, a story about a hero who forges his own path and is an innovator and tries new things, in the sense that almost any hero's journey is sort of an individualistic, kind of Western way of looking at stories. And I think that there is some nuance to parse there and some ways of looking at how that might support more libertarian themes as opposed to the more progressive collectivist themes that some people might read into it. But that's more about the tropes and structure of Western stories, I think, rather than A Bug's Life in particular. And I just want to talk about all of the different ways that I don't think it makes sense. So you mentioned the grasshoppers. And the grasshoppers are interesting because they could be described as bureaucrats or people who, or the 1% or something.
All right. I even read an article that the grasshoppers were described as the property owners, which also didn't really make sense.
Also not accurate because they contribute nothing to the ant society on a sort of benevolent or malevolent level. They're not even attempting the facade of trying to provide services that a socialist state might provide.
I will disagree very quickly. The services, yes. The services, yes. So they're not going to try and provide healthcare and all this. But there's one part where Hopper is talking at the very beginning of the film when he's introduced, and he's saying, there's a lot of other bugs out there, and we're protecting you.
Well, here's what I'll say. It's not that he's actually providing. It's a protection racket. It's a criminal organization as such. So they're not actually providing a real capitalist service that engages in free market exchange. It's a coerced, implied threat of violence, which is that either we're going to allow other people to do this to you, or perhaps we're going to use the thumper, our crazy grasshopper, to eat you because you haven't given us what we wanted. So in a real sense, it's neither of those things.
Well,
and you could
I have to say a sentence that's never been said before, I think. To understand Bug's Life, one must understand Franz Oppenheimer's The State. So
oh my God. I'm so done with you.
There's a book in 1908, and it theorizes by this guy, Franz Oppenheimer, and he's theorizing the state was actually what we call the state today was originally roving bands of barbarians and warlords who eventually settled down and just collected tax money off of people. And that's basically what the Bug's Life is about. The grasshoppers, so some people say the grasshoppers are capitalists. In the Marxian language, they take away the surplus labor, the little bit of extra on top from the ants, and they keep it for themselves in what's called primitive accumulation. But what's really is that they're just a bunch of gangsters who come around and collect the protection racket, just like you said. But people are kind of blinded to that almost because they think that the story's unequal. And it's the inequality is such a big theme today in politics. The grasshopper is the ants definitely live a very meager life and doesn't seem particularly enjoyable. But at the end of the day, they're all just eating grains. The inequality isn't really what matters. It matters that they laze around all day. Because the original idea behind Bug's Life is there's Aesop's fables, which are these ancient Greek stories that always have a little message to them. And there's one where there's a cicada, not a grasshopper originally, but he sings and dances all summer while the ant diligently collects food. And then when summer's over, the cicada says, "Can I have some of your food?" to the ant. And the ant says, "Why don't you dance and sing through all of winter?" And the lads who made Bug's Life decided, what if the grasshopper or cicada just decided to take the food? And that's what they do. And a lot of Bug's Life is about how awful people like Hopper are because they don't even make any sort of effort to try and justify what they're doing. They are primitive feudal gangsters. They're much more like medieval warlords or something than anything else. If they're capitalists, what's the service they're providing? What are they selling? Is there even a middle class? Is there a currency exchange? None of this exists, obviously, because it's a kid's film and it's about bugs.
Well, I think too, there's this is definitely reading into it, but there's like also like a religious undertone to it. So like they're putting their grain that they're collecting on the offering stone, and then they like go and hide to make sure, like hide from Hopper. This is like in the beginning, to make sure that like they don't like face the wrath of Hopper. It's almost like there's some type of underlying like understanding that the grasshoppers are like their saviors, or like it's like almost perverse. And I think it's more so the language of like the offering stone. It's not like, oh, they're not saying, oh, they're stealing our food. They're like, we're putting it up on the offering stone, as in like it's our pleasure to serve Hopper, you know what I mean? And I think that language is like, it's very subtle, but it definitely has religious undertones too.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up the ant and the grasshopper, Paul, because I was reading about this too. I didn't realize that this was an Aesop's fable reference and a sort of twisting of the story. But it makes sense when you look into it, because the original fable itself has been told and retold and reframed so many different times throughout history that it's kind of emblematic of the points that we were making earlier about people are able to read into this story what they really, really want. So there are very conflicting lessons and morals that one can extract from the ant and the grasshopper, and they have over time, about who is the virtuous one in the relationship. Is it the ant who works hard all summer and then during the winter is able to sustain himself, and the grasshopper is lazy for not being diligent and working for what he needs? Or is the ant not virtuous because he doesn't share the things that he has accumulated, and that if you have wealth, you should provide it? And it really comes down to the sort of virtues that you think are more important. And I wonder if there's a sort of, opposition and a line that we can't cross there, because it becomes about what you value over the other, the way you interpret this story, and how do you get past that? And is there a point in that case? And for instance, I think it was, let me see here. Oh, yes. Roger Lestrange comment that the ant's virtue and vice in many cases are hardly indistinguishable but by the name. So it's really about the labels that we put on these characters more than anything that they are intending to tell. And that's the same with the grasshoppers or socialist bureaucrats, or their capitalist extractors who are, taking away the labor of the people that are doing all of the work. You can find a way to bend the interpretation of a story when it is as simple as A Bug's Life and make it say what you want. And that doesn't mean any of them are going to be necessarily strong arguments, but people are going to make them. And I kind of grow frustrated with that people will look to these stories that do not have outright morals, or if they do, it is much simpler. It's about the individual achievements of particular characters than any system that they're trying to critique. But that inherently does support libertarian themes, which is that the individual, when given the freedom to do what they think is best and take chances and experiment, has the capacity to make a difference in the world. So who knows? Maybe I'm totally wrong, and that is the moral, and it's inherent in the story. And,
I think there's a moral to the story that can be viewed in a libertarian lens, and it's that we can all be more than what we think. A lot of the movie, characters have an idea about what the world looks like. And it kind of there's a lot of parallels to this in real life, that people thought that there was a natural order to the world for a very long time. This is the way things are. Some people are born this way, some people are born that way. There's different classes, different lords, different aristocrats, all the above. But the reality is that all that doesn't exist, and it's just stories we tell ourselves. And so at the beginning of the movie, we hear Hopper's version of what the story of life. He even makes a reference to Lion King with the circle of life. Because the Lion King is
I love
that famous Mufasa. It just basically explains why it's okay to eat wildebeests to his son, and it's kind of like a joke. Like the Lion King almost like supports some sort of like divine monarchy when you read into it way too much, like we're doing now. But in Bug's Life, Hopper just basically says ants are put on this earth to pick food for grasshoppers. By the end of the film, I think it's Princess Ada says, "Well, we pick all this food. you don't do anything, you just consume. It doesn't say that, but realizing that the way people talk about the world, it isn't that way at all. And that's kind of goes back to Flick and Dot with the whole idea of the seed, that we can be so much more. And by the end of the film, the colony is completely unrecognizable. So I think if there was one thing I want to take with this film that I think is quite politically neutral, but has a bit of a libertarian leaning, is that we can all kind of kick away what we think our so-called nature is and become a lot more.
I also think too that there's like a more meta discussion going on because it is ants. So like if this movie had a different set of bugs, which I was debating this with someone, if this movie had, they were a group of butterflies, which would make no sense, but whatever. I think people wouldn't be reading as much of a political story into it, just because ants and bees are the two insects that are always used in like in a collectivist mindset to demonstrate, like we were talking about earlier. And I think that almost by just in the nature of Flick and his buddies being ants, makes you automatically assume that they're taking the position of like the working class, just because all the stories and like everyone that understands anything about ants knows that they like don't really necessarily have like a mind of their own. They're very much hive mind, like bees. And they like have one ant that they like answer to. And I think that is why a lot of people maybe read into this story too much from like a collectivist mindset. I also went down a little rabbit hole. So like Bugs Life came out the same time as Ants. They were actually developed in tandem before a studio split, and this was also one a lot of directors and producers were going after like good stories versus like going after remaking like superhero movies with like crossing universes. So there was like a lot of competition for this story. So it's split in tandem, and then they created Ants and Bugs Life. But the only other insect movie I could come up with, especially like coming out of Disney or like the bigger studios, was Bee Movie after this.
I was going to say, why didn't we talk about Bee Movie in tandem with this? Because there's so much that is similar, but totally not at all.
Yeah.
Like it goes in a completely different direction.
Yeah. But like, and then I was like, that's so odd because there's like, in one year you had two very like bug centric movies, and then we don't get anything until Bee Movie, which wasn't, God, it must have been like at least 15 years later that Bee Movie came out. But still, I thought it was interesting that these came out around the same time. I don't like Ants. I've probably only seen that movie maybe twice ever.
Do you remember the woodlice scene? The war they have?
They have a war?
Okay, you haven't seen it in too long then, because in Ants, there's the most traumatic scene where they go off, like the main character accidentally is drafted into a war, and they fight, no, the termites. They're not called woodlice, they're called termites.
Yes. I do, I remember that larger part.
That was traumatic, and there's one guy who like gets melted and loses his whole body and everything. It is like terrifying for a child's movie.
Well, Ants is known to be a much more adult film, but I will say, A Bug's Life has some shocking, dark, almost imagery in it. Like Hopper threatens to kill his brother at one point. Like if I hadn't promised Mom that I wouldn't kill you, I'd kill you, which I don't know how many times in like Toy Story or a Pixar movie, usually there's like a metaphor or something, but he's like, no. I will kill you. And then there's like animated blood in the tapestry that the kids make at the presentation. Yeah. And then they drop Hopper into the like birds who were like eating him at the very end, and of course they fade to black and they cut away. But I was like, I'm sure there's exceptions to this, and it can get a lot darker in certain Pixar films and such, but I was kind of shocked at some of this. I do have to say,
I think this was like in an edgier time of Pixar too, right? It's not Pixar. I think the list I looked at, it's not even like in the top 15 of Pixar movies.
Because it's not as good as all the other ones. Like, I'll come out and say it.
It's not WALL-E, so.
I watched this movie and I was like, this could have been a TV episode, and they stretched it into an hour and 39 minutes. I was like,
it's a little bit of a short story. But it's like, it's a weird movie because they kind of copy like Seven Samurai's plot. Have you ever heard about this, Landry?
Yeah, when they go to the city, especially, yeah.
That I always found that so bizarre. But I was gonna say, beyond the gore and explicit killing, one thing I thought was kind of interesting today is the Ladybug character of Francis. I think that's well before its time.
And that's a good lesson. It really is. Like they teach Francis to get in touch with his feminine side and understand this sort of it's not explicitly gender fluidity, but it's certainly trying to reject heteronormative gender roles, which I think is an exciting thing that we can introduce to people, even if it's not, explicit in a sense, but it's kind of just being like, relax about it. It's not as rigid as you need to sort of portray it as, and have fun with it, which it is kind of cool because he's very like rooted in his and sort of rejecting the perception that he gets as a male ladybug, but learning to embrace it and be celebrated for the things that he sort of is presenting as, allows him to feel more complete about himself. And
look at all the content you're getting out of Bug's Life just after you badmouth it. After you say it's not a good movie, you just had this little spiel about how deep it is, how much is going on. It's a great movie.
Right.
We're not bad mouthing it. It's just not.
It's not a Toy Story. It's not Wall-E.
Toy Story.
It's right.
Yeah.
It's not that great for a Pixar film.
Yeah.
That's your opinion.
I will say the casting though in this movie is great. Phyllis Diller is awesome. Ashley Tisdale and Hayden Panettiere as child stars. Like I wouldn't have ever known it was them, but it's them. All of the circus animals, amazing casting.
There is an interesting thing going on because like there's a lot of through the whole movie there's a lot of like in-group and out-group like interesting social dynamics going on, and the circus bugs are like on the fringes of like the ant society, right? So like they have access, like ants can go and talk to them, but at the same time they're like almost not in the same economy. They're like a traveling circus troupe, and I thought that was the best way to be like to show like Flick that there's like a world outside of like.
I wish they spent more time in the city. They didn't really spend. He went to one bar, found the first group of people he saw, and he was like, "Boom, these are my guys. This is the one."
Okay, but I do that too. So
I get that. I was like, I'm gonna go back to my house. It's not worth it. This is interesting though, because I think it is emblematic of. Because we were trying to label like what type of political or economic system is actually going on in ants if you're going to critique it. And it's not pure socialism by any means. And it's not capitalism because we're not seeing markets or exchange or anything. The best thing that I think you could kind of read into it and this is being charitable, I think, is it's kind of a state capacity libertarianism message where it's like there are definitely forces at work in the ant colony that are trying to make everything much more equitable. So there's like a strong kind of welfare state where everyone pitches in and their work contributes to a collective thing that gets distributed to everyone at some level. But there is a little bit of room for innovation, at least toward the end. We see the reed launchers that Flick develops being used by everyone in this sort of technological innovation. But then outside of the ant colony, you're not seeing that. It's kind of run down. The city is kind of portrayed as dirty and gross. And even though there's a lot
outside
going
of like
on,
a caravan, and that's where they live. That's just the way they do.
Well, right, but they're all happy. But it's kind of, to me, maybe it's a sort of examination of how nation states that have strong welfare or equity are not necessarily always super friendly to outsiders. For instance, I'm in Finland. That's where I live. And I mean, as the people at, a lot of places will tell you, they're kind of known for being held up by people on the left as like ultra progressive, socialist, and people on the right will very quickly tell you that people in Nordic countries actually have much, much less business regulation. They just have a large welfare state, but the lax regulations in the private market allow that sort of stuff to transfer to the welfare state. And so marrying them, while it's not, necessarily making either of those sides really happy, neither side has the boogeyman or the person they want to hold up as the exemplar in the Nordic model. But you can also point to that and say, while it's great that the Nordic model can do that, it is not necessarily super easy to access if you are outside of the in-group, as Natalie was getting at with this in-group, out-group dynamic, they purposefully make it kind of hard and cumbersome to get access to those things. Now, there are ways, if you were to visit a place like Finland, like where I live, you will have access just upon visiting to a lot of state services. But to get full access, to reap the full benefits, there are a lot of hoops that you have to go through, and the bureaucracy is very thick. And that is designed in a way not necessarily to discourage people from engaging with it, but it is symptomatic of the work that it takes to put into that. And it is discouraging to get people, and it shows that it isn't as scalable as people might like to admit and may not work in all circumstances. So if there is a comment about the type of markets and economic model that you could make, maybe it's something like that instead.
And you said that Bug's Life, there wasn't anything to say. You said this.
You're pulling it out of me. It's all you. You and Natalie.
I would like to point out that Meanie has wanted to talk about A Bug's Life.
For how long?
For
a while.
I think it's been 3 years.
So no, it's been longer,
3 years that he said it out loud.
Yeah.
Also, like, it's been in his heart for so much longer.
Oh yeah, definitely. No, I didn't watch a lot of kids' films growing up, so this is one of my ones I was like a big fan of. I didn't really like, when you guys talking about Pixar, I actually didn't know which ones are Pixar and which one's Disney, because I wasn't really into all that as a kid. But I really did I liked Bug's Life and Mulan. Those are the ones I really liked. And I don't really know why I liked Bug's Life so much as a kid, because it's not like I thought about it so much. I was like, I want to be like Flick or anything, because he's like a flipping bug. But I don't know, something about it was really cool to me.
It's also quite confusing why you would like Mulan, but we'll get back
because
to
she's
that
a queen.
some other time.
I don't know.
She is a
what's
queen,
so
and the
cool
music
about
is
it.
great, and it's very funny, and Mulan is great.
Yeah, but the new Mulan doesn't have my favorite character in it, so
Mushu,
of
course.
Rip.
Also, did they do the music in the new Mulan? Do they have Reflection? When will my reflection show? Is it called Reflection? I don't know if that's what it's called, but it's a great song. It is
great song.
I mean, it's a barn
It's
burner.
a banger.
I was going to say, I think that the ants, I think you're giving them too much credit. Because in the story, none of them have ever left the island. So they've never left the island. None of them have ever been to the city before. They go there. And I think the movie, they definitely, maybe they wanted to spend more time in the city, or maybe they don't have more of a plot there, and they just kind of zoomed over it because it would have been awkward to do, or they didn't have many ideas on it. But either way, the bugs are basically like tribal people. They just pick the food, they go into their mound. And even another part of it that I thought was kind of interesting is there's a line where the princess is talking and she's like, our former ants, they built this massive colony, we can do it too. And I think that's, I'm sorry to bring it always back to like history, but it's kind of an interesting idea considering after the fall of the Roman Empire, a lot of medieval people lived in the ruins of like a much greater civilization, and they're like, oh, I could never do that. We could never build aqueducts that long, or structures with that kind of dome or cement or anything like that. And sometimes I wonder, like in Bug's Life, you get the impression that there's like some sort of decline in the colony, because like it was earlier on we mentioned that some people associate the ants with the working class, and I find that like, I don't know how people think they're saying that in like a sympathetic way, because the first ant you see in the movie, a leaf falls and he can't walk around it without the help of a supervisor. Like any Marxist saying that a supervisor is required in production sounds bizarre to me, to be honest. Like it's just this idea that working class people can't do anything for themselves.
There was also this really great part where Flick was like upset and he was like, just squish me. And he like put his head under the one bug's foot and was like, just step on me and squish me. Which is also dark. Back to the Pixar thing.
That is actually really dark, yeah.
Really dark. I also think another reason that the Hopper and his buddies are more bullies, but it also gets read into that they have like, more of a maniac leadership style, let's call it. He says this one quote, and I think we should definitely include it. He says, "You let one ant stand up to us, then they all might stand up. Those puny little ants outnumber us 100 to 1. If they ever figure that out, there goes our way of life. It's not about food. It's about keeping those ants in line." So I think that line specifically is why people read so much into this movie, because it's packed with the idea that like Hopper is fully aware, like fully conscious of what him and his gang is doing. And he's also fully aware that it's like hanging on a very, very tight rope. And if any ants like step out of line, they could all like suddenly get together and realize like, oh, we don't actually have to be doing this anymore. Which is why I think people read like the social dynamics into it and like the political look at it from a political lens, just because like that specific line is like
hit the nail on the head. That is the line. Years and years ago, I was in college and I was finishing my dissertation and I was a bit like tired. I was like, I need to like chill out and just watch some movie that doesn't require any thought. Little did I know, I put on Bug's Life, thinking I'd be like, oh, this is just a kid's film, whatever. And that line completely grabbed me. And so I looked it up the line, and I found a bunch of different places that posted it, like all sorts, like all these like communist Facebook groups, like Black Lives Matters ones, even some like conservative ones had some ideas about it for a while. So the fact that everyone can hop on this one idea that there's a boogeyman out there, that there's someone who's just a parasite who takes and takes more, and they get away with it somehow, and there's hundreds of regular people who need to get back at them. That's a pretty powerful idea.
Yeah, it's kind of a populist message, which, I mean, if anything, maybe that's the lasting impact of A Bug's Life. People don't realize it was, people label all these things, the election of Trump, et cetera, et cetera. No, it all goes back to A Bug's Life, the authoritarian populism. That's what it is.
That's where it all started.
The movie does just gloss over the fact that like, oh yeah, let's have a princess, let's have a queen and all that. Let's not make any fundamental changes to our structure of government. But sure, it's a kid's movie.
And also, so all the ants are related. So it's like a
Didn't
big
get that.
family, as opposed to it's like a family ties matrilineal monarchy with like socialist, like a large welfare state that is being covered by a protection racket by how many grasshoppers are there? Like on
Unclear.
screen,
They're outnumbered 100 to 1.
Exactly. That's what I'm like. But also like in the real world, I don't know the answer to this. I'm not a scientist. Scientists, get in the comments or the podcast reviews or tweet at us or something. Could the amount of grass, who would win in a fight? Let's say 10 grasshoppers or 1,000 ants. I'm curious because I want to know, like, where did they get was it just the fable? I don't know. I don't believe.
Also,
I think it ruins it for me. It takes me out of it.
Do grasshoppers eat ants? Like in real life?
So many questions to ask.
Well, I don't know. Do they, or do they
I
just
don't think
beat
they
them
do.
up, like because they have a grudge or something?
I looked
Also,
at it's the first
why
thing that
is-
comes up. Do grasshoppers eat ants? They do not eat ants. They eat plants, leaves, and cereal crops.
Also,
So in the movie, they don't eat them. They actually, yeah, that's a good point, actually. They actually don't eat them in the movie. They are specifically using them as like slave labor, basically.
And why is Thumper the grasshopper so angry while all the other ones seem just, kind of like bums or jerks or something? Like, if anything, that's another
Thumper's
really
the
terrible
wild card.
thing.
He's the one they like bring out to sick him on people.
I know, that's
know?
why, but I'm like, who hurt you? I'm like, this obviously very traumatized grasshopper, they are using for selfish ends, and if anything, just furthering the cycle of violence that seems to have been acted upon him. And it's just, I mean, it just goes. They're very villainous. I'll give them that.
No female grasshoppers. It's a man's game there.
I mean, if that's not commentary, I don't know what is.
Yeah. Another thing I was just thinking of. So are ants like there are queen ants? Is that accurate? Like in real life, like a queen?
Is that
ant?
canon?
Yes.
No, because like I was like, well, why is the ant a princess then?
She's a
Is
queen
that
in
implying
training.
that she is not the queen ant?
Not yet.
Well, Phyllis Diller's character is the queen, right? The
Right.
old one. So
Yeah.
she's the queen, and then but then the princess ant is there. But also, are there other female ants in ant colonies, or is there
I
just
think
the
so.
one?
I don't think they're
which
like
is
bees.
interesting. Okay, I was gonna say, but also it's interesting because male ants don't usually live that long. Like they make a joke about them living short in the movie, but also they don't show them like working a little bit and then it'll be like, and now I'll die. Now, of course, we're looking on the very shallow timeline here. What looks like a whole life to these bugs might be, a day or something to us, but Who knows? I don't know.
If you ever want to learn more about ants, there's a great YouTube channel called Ants Canada of a guy who like has
Oh my
big colonies of ants, and I've learned so much about it from it. I did not realize the idea that there's the queen ants or anything like that. That blew my mind. But if you want to learn more about ants,
I didn't know that female ants had wings and could fly.
yeah,
I didn't know that. I was watching this and I was like, that's not scientific. It's totally true, which, as a person from Texas where fire ants exist, is terrifying. But I don't know if fire ants have wings, but I'm going to find out.
Could you
This is
imagine if this was if the ants in this movie were fire ants?
be cool. They wouldn't.
would be
They'd be able to
pretty
defend
cool.
themselves. That's the problem with movies like this, though, is using animals. Is you kind of like you step into tropes, and you kind of like start to act as if, like when we talk about, all people are born free and equal, it's because we're all humans, so we all have the same rights. But once you start having animals of different abilities and different sorts and all, the movie kind of like a lot of different movies with animals almost justify the differences between them sometimes, as if this is the way things are meant to be, and I find that very odd.
It's kind of a social Darwinism angle. It's very much like some people are made different and they're just, fated to not be fit and to get, there are predators and then
See,
there
that's
are
Lion
prey.
King. That's what Lion King's about. But like Ant's life is about not giving in to your nature and being something more than that.
It's interesting though, because what you're saying it is emblematic of what the film tries to get around, which is the idea that, this sort of like American dream that people can break out of their roles and their species, in the metaphor of animals, and, rise, and anyone can make something of themselves, like the seed metaphor that you talked about before, when in reality, the ant is always going to be an ant and it has a role, and a male ant is not going to transcend and suddenly become the king ant that everyone celebrates. He's going to work and then he's going to die. And I mean, yeah, you can read into that metaphor and it might kill the movie and be like, well, you're taking all of the fun away, but do we lose something in these metaphors like that? Or do we, get fixed into certain ways of thinking? Is like Natalie was talking about, of viewing the ants simply as collectivists.
I think too, like when you do like animals, or you're like getting into the dynamics of their societies, or bugs, for instance. I'm thinking to B movie too, like the whole idea is that they're using ants or they're using bees to fight against like what we understand about ants and bees too, though, right? So like in B movie, he like they're like on the little tram car and they all get assigned their job, and it's like one person has like the little honey hat on his head and he like wipes the honey. The one person then the upper class in B movie are the people that get to collect the pollen, right? And they're like the buff bees, right?
They're the Top Gun,
Right? They're the
Tom
Top Gun
Cruise as a bee, Goose and Maverick fly out to collect honey. Yeah,
exactly. So, and like the whole idea behind that movie too is that like, I'm blanking on the main bee's name.
Jerry Seinfeld.
Yeah, but the actual bee's name. Similar to how Flick is treated in A Bug's Life, like he is trying to like break out of stereotypes and do something that like bees don't do. Remember, he like wants to be a lawyer and like, which again, great plot, but like it's this idea of like you're not stuck in the hole, right? You're not stuck doing with like what the bee world or the ant world or whatever has told you that you must do, and that like you can challenge the rules or you can like challenge the playing field. And I think both of those movies have, like Paul said, that message. And I just think we do it with bugs because it's more entertaining. Because like we can't have that many human people. Not human people, human movies that have this same message, because
we can't have that many human people. Natalie coming out in favor of population control. This has been Pop and Lock. Thank you so much for listening.
Have more babies.
If that's something that you feel comfortable with, yes, you should. I do want to ask.
Bug's Life and B movie were both kind of movies that didn't like stick around long in the collective imagination. I think it's because people just, I don't know, maybe the American dream kind of stuff. Oh, B movie did stick around. Before you say anything, it stuck around as a meme. But like the whole message of,
yes,
be more than you are and everyone can do something. I think a lot of people are kind of like sick of that message and find it very trite and almost childish or naive. And so it's kind of like ignored. And that's why I don't really see people talking about Bug's Life a whole lot besides.
Well, I think the B movie was essentially an updated version of Bug's Life, right? So like in Bug's Life, I feel like Flick is more like he is a hard worker in manufacturing, and they're like, let's make B movie, and we'll make him like a lawyer or like a news person or something. Like they'll like updated the work he was doing. I think they're very similar movies.
Thanks for listening. As always, the best way to keep in touch with us and get more Pop and Lock content is to follow us on Twitter. You can find us at the handle @PopandLockPod. That's Pop, the letter N, Lock with an E, like the philosopher, Pod. Make sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. We look forward to unraveling your favorite show or movie next time.